Two major earthquakes struck the same patch of the Pacific seafloor 60 seconds apart. Not one violent quake, but two, a magnitude 6.0, and then, 1 minute later, a larger magnitude 6.6, off the coast of Kamchatka, on the exact fault that drowned coastlines across the Pacific in 1952. Within another minute, a tsunami warning went out across the North Pacific, and then the sea stayed flat. Tonight we are going to take that strange, frightening morning apart piece by piece, because the way this fault broke raises the one question seismologists can never answer in the moment. Was that the ground letting go, or the ground getting ready? Before we get into it, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. 60 seconds. 2 earthquakes. The ground broke twice before anyone could finish reacting to the first time. On the morning of June 19, 2026, off the eastern edge of the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake tore through the floor of the Pacific Ocean. That alone would have been a serious event, the kind that rattles a coastline and sends people reaching for doorframes. But 60 seconds later, before the shaking from the first one had even settled, the same patch of seafloor ruptured again, and this time it was bigger, a magnitude 6.6. 2 major earthquakes, 1 minute apart, in the same small stretch of ocean. That is not how earthquakes usually behave, and the way they broke is the thread we're going to follow tonight, because it leads somewhere most people never think to look. We tend to imagine an earthquake as a single, clean event. The ground moves, it stops, and then come the smaller aftershocks, each one weaker than the last, fading out like the rings spreading from a stone dropped in water. That is the normal pattern, and it is the pattern almost every earthquake follows. What happened off Kamchatka was different. 2 shocks of nearly the same enormous size, back to back, separated by barely the length of a held breath. Seismologists have a name for this. They call it a doublet, and a doublet is the kind of thing that makes the people who study earthquakes stop what they are doing and lean toward the screen. Here is why that single word matters so much. When one giant earthquake is followed immediately by another of comparable size, it tells you that the first one did not release all the pressure. It tells you the energy is not bleeding out in an orderly fashion. Instead, the first rupture may have loaded the next patch of fault past its breaking point, like one section of a dam failing and instantly forcing the load onto the next section. And once you're thinking in those terms, a darker question opens up underneath you. The question that sits at the centre of everything we're going to talk about tonight. If the first quake could trigger the second, what is stopping the second from triggering a third? And what if the third is the one that actually matters? Let me put you in the geography, because location is not a detail here. It is the whole story. These earthquakes struck roughly 133 to 156 kilometers east-southeast of a city called Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. If you have never heard that name, you are not alone, but you should know it, because it is one of the most dangerously placed cities on Earth. It sits near the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula, a long finger of land and volcanoes that juts down off the far eastern coast of Russia into the North Pacific. Around 180,000 people live there, and it is the largest city for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. It is also perched directly above one of the most violent geological boundaries on the entire planet. We will get to exactly why that boundary is so dangerous, but hold the image in your mind for now. A city of nearly 200,000 people, sitting on the edge of a fault that has, within living memory, done something almost unthinkable. The 2 main shocks were shallow, which is part of what makes this story tense rather than routine. Depth, as we will see later, changes everything about how an earthquake behaves and what it can do to the sea above it. One agency placed these ruptures only a handful of kilometers below the seafloor. That is close to the surface, close enough that the energy arrives at the ocean floor with very little rock left to absorb it. And when the seafloor itself moves that violently, that close to the water, the ocean has a way of answering. We will come back to what the ocean did, and what it almost did, because that is one of the strangest parts of this entire day. Let me slow down on that word doublet, because everything we are going to explore tonight hangs on it, and most people have never heard it used this way. A doublet is not just 2 earthquakes that happen near each other. It is 2 earthquakes of comparable major size, breaking close together in both space and time, close enough that they cannot reasonably be treated as unrelated. The ordinary relationship between earthquakes is a hierarchy. There is a clear king, the main shock, and then a court of smaller aftershocks that bow beneath it, each one decisively weaker. A doublet breaks that hierarchy. It gives you two kings, almost equal, almost at once. And when the natural order of a fault breaks like that, it is telling you something about the state of the rock that a single earthquake never could. Think about the 60 seconds themselves, because that interval is doing a tremendous amount of work in this story. 60 seconds is nothing. It is a single drawn breath, a held note, the time it takes to read this sentence aloud a few times over. In the life of a fault that has been winding tighter for decades, 60 seconds is indistinguishable from instantaneous. So when the magnitude 6.0 broke and the magnitude 6.6 followed 1 minute later, the fault was not recovering between them, not resetting, not pausing to gather itself. It was responding. The second rupture happened because the first one had just happened. The stress from one slip racing into the neighbouring rock and finding it already near its limit. That is the signature of a fault that is loaded close to the edge across a wide area, and it is exactly why this opening minute set the tone for everything that followed. Now picture how this looked to the instruments, because the human story and the scientific story diverge here in a way worth understanding. To a person standing on the ground, a doublet might feel like one long, horrifying convulsion, a shaking that seems to ease and then redouble. But to a seismometer, the two events are cleanly separate, two distinct ruptures with their own sharp beginnings, their own release of energy, their own fingerprints written in the wiggling lines of the record. Within moments, automated systems around the world had detected both, sized them, located them, and flagged the pattern. Somewhere, an analyst looked at two major earthquakes stamped 1 minute apart on the same patch of the Kamchatka margin and felt the particular chill that comes with seeing the rulebook bent. Because the rulebook says big earthquakes are usually lonely. This one was not. And this is the thread I need you to carry through everything that follows, because we will keep returning to it from new angles. The doublet is not interesting because it was loud or because it made the news. It is interesting because it is evidence, hard evidence, that the ruptures off Kamchatka are capable of triggering one another, that one violent slip on this fault can reach into the surrounding rock and provoke the next. Once you have seen a fault do that twice in 60 seconds, you cannot unsee the possibility that it might do it a third time, on a longer fuse, with a larger result. That possibility, small but real, is the quiet engine of dread running underneath this entire event, and it is why two earthquakes a minute apart became something the whole Pacific monitoring community took seriously. I want to give you one more way to picture why two near-equal shocks are so different from the ordinary pattern, because the contrast is the whole reason this story exists. Imagine a row of heavy dominoes, each one standing for a stuck patch of fault holding back decades of strain. In a normal large earthquake, one big domino falls and the small ones around it wobble and topple in a fading cascade, which are the aftershocks. That is the orderly hierarchy we expect. One ruler and a fading court. A doublet is what you see when one heavy domino falls and knocks over a second heavy one right beside it, almost instantly, before anything settles. It means the big pieces were standing close enough and loaded heavily enough that one could bring down another of its own size. And the unavoidable thought, once you have watched that happen, is to wonder how many more heavy dominoes are standing in that row and how close together they are. That image is the anxiety of this entire event in miniature, and it is why a single minute off Kamchatka sets so many people on edge. Keep that single, strange minute fixed in your mind as we go, because everything else we explore tonight is really an attempt to answer the question it raises. Two major earthquakes, 60 seconds apart, on a fault with a catastrophic past. Was that the ground letting off pressure, or was it the ground gathering itself? The honest truth is that the minute itself cannot tell you, and neither can the hours that followed, and that is precisely why it matters so much. But the doublet was only the opening move. Two earthquakes in 60 seconds would have been remarkable on its own. What came next turned a remarkable morning into something that had monitoring stations around the Pacific watching in real time, and it is where the real shape of this story begins to show itself, because the ground off Kamchatka did not break twice and go quiet, it kept breaking. Part 2. The Barrage. The aftershocks did not trickle in, they came in a flood after the magnitude 6.0 and the magnitude 6.6 struck within that single minute, the same small box of ocean floor off Kamchatka kept rupturing again and again for hours. A magnitude 4.9, then a magnitude 5.0, then another 4.9, this one farther down, a 4.5, and then, well into the sequence, something that should not happen if a fault is calmly settling down, a magnitude 5.8, followed by a 5.2. By the time the morning was over, more than a dozen earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater had struck that one stretch of the Kamchatka margin, and the larger ones were still arriving long after the main shocks. Stay with me on what that actually represents, because the raw count undersells it, and the count is the clue that ties directly back to the question we are chasing. A magnitude 4.5 earthquake is not nothing. On its own, in a populated area it can crack plaster and knock objects off shelves and frighten an entire town. We're talking about more than a dozen of those, or stronger, in a single morning, stacked one on top of another in a piece of ocean you could cross in a couple of hours by boat. That is not a fault releasing pressure and relaxing. That is a fault that has been violently disturbed across a wide area, with many separate sections of rock all failing in close succession. The technical phrase is an energetic aftershock sequence, but the plain language version is simpler and more honest. The ground out there was coming apart in pieces, and it kept coming apart for a long time. There is a specific detail in that barrage that deserves your attention, because it is the kind of thing a casual glance would miss, and a seismologist would circle immediately. The magnitude 5.8 aftershock arrived late and large. In a well-behaved sequence, the aftershocks should generally get weaker as time passes. A strong one showing up well after the main shocks, nearly as large as anything in the sequence, is a sign that the fault is not following the gentle fading script we would hope for. It is a sign that the system still has a great deal of energy left to release, and that it is not yet clear where the bottom of this sequence is. And that uncertainty, the not knowing where the bottom is exactly the feeling that defines this entire event for the people watching it. Now think about what it would be like to live underneath that. Picture Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky on that morning, a city already intimately familiar with shaking ground, suddenly enduring not one violent earthquake but a continuous, hours-long sequence of them. The first jolt. Then, before your pulse has settled, a second and larger one. Then the long grinding procession of aftershocks, each one forcing the same question through your mind that the scientists were asking through their instruments. Is it over? Is this the last one? Or is the ground only clearing its throat? That question is not paranoia. On this particular fault, it is the correct question to ask, and the reason it is correct is the thing we are building toward. Let me give you a sense of the energy involved, because the magnitude numbers hide more than they reveal, and understanding the scale is what makes the barrage feel real. The magnitude scale is not a simple ladder, where each step is the same height. It is built so that each whole step up represents a roughly 32-fold increase in the energy released. A magnitude 6 releases something like 32 times the energy of a magnitude 5, and a magnitude 7 releases roughly 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 5. So when I tell you that this sequence produced a magnitude 6.6 along with a magnitude 5.8, a 5.2, and more than a dozen events in the 5s and high 4s, I'm not describing a tidy row of similar jolts. I'm describing one enormous release followed by a string of releases that were each, individually, powerful enough to be a serious news event somewhere on Earth on a quiet day. All of it, packed into one morning in one patch of sea. Hold the geography in your mind again, because the tightness of the cluster is part of what makes it so notable to the people who study these things. Every one of these earthquakes struck within a small box of ocean, a stretch you could draw a circle around on a map with the tip of your finger. This was not a scattering of unrelated quakes spread across the Pacific. It was a concentrated assault on a single section of one fault, dozens of kilometers across, all of it failing in close succession over a few hours. When seismologists map an aftershock cloud like that, the dots cluster around the area of the original rupture, and the size and shape of that cloud actually traces out the patch of fault that broke. A dense, energetic cloud like the one off Kamchatka tells you that a large area of the megathrust was disturbed, and the larger the disturbed area, the more the whole system has been put into motion. That is the connection back to our central question. A big, busy aftershock cloud is a big, busy fault, and a big, busy fault on this particular boundary is exactly the thing nobody can afford to take their eyes off. Consider too what those hours were like for the instruments and the people reading them. A modern seismic network does not sleep, and on a morning like this one it lights up like a switchboard during an emergency. Each new aftershock arrives as a fresh spike, is located, is sized, is added to the growing list. The analysts watching are not just logging events, they are watching the shape of the sequence form in real time, asking with every new arrival whether the pattern is holding to the script or wandering off it. Is the rate of new quakes dropping the way it should? Is the largest aftershock staying within the expected bounds? Or is it creeping up toward the size of the main shock, which would be a genuine warning sign? Every one of those questions was live that morning, and none of them had a guaranteed answer, because a sequence this energetic does not reveal its ending until it is good and ready. And that late, large aftershock, the magnitude 5.8, deserves one more moment, because it is the kind of detail that turns watchful into worried. In the cleanest, most reassuring sequences, the aftershocks march downward in size as the hours pass, the fault visibly exhausting itself. A strong aftershock arriving well into the sequence, nearly rivaling the largest events, is the opposite of exhaustion. It suggests the fault still had a substantial reserve of stored stress to spend, that the morning's violence had not drained it. On a gentle fault, that might mean little. On the Kuril-Kamchatka Megathrust, with the history this fault carries, a sequence that refuses to wind down on schedule is precisely the pattern that keeps the monitoring centres leaning toward their screens long after the first shocks have faded from the news. There is something worth pausing on in the simple endurance of a sequence like this, because duration is its own kind of violence. A single earthquake, however large, is over in seconds. The ground heaves, and then it stops, and the survivors begin to take stock. A barrage is different. It does not let you take stock, because every time you start to believe it is finished, the ground moves again. Hour after hour the aftershocks kept coming off Kamchatka, and each one reopened the same wound of uncertainty, the same question of whether this was the last one or the prelude to something larger. For the people living through it, that is psychologically corrosive in a way a single shock is not. You cannot relax. You cannot rebuild your sense of safety, because the evidence that the danger has passed never quite arrives. That sustained dread is part of what makes an energetic aftershock sequence on a dangerous fault so much more than the sum of its magnitudes. Consider also what a long barrage does to the physical structures that have to endure it, because this is where the danger compounds. Buildings and infrastructure are designed to survive a certain amount of shaking, but they are not infinitely resilient. A structure weakened by the first major shock may be standing, but compromised, its margins of safety quietly eaten away. Then comes the next strong aftershock, and the next, each one testing an already injured building. This is why aftershock sequences are so feared in populated areas. The main shock cracks the structure, and the aftershocks finish it. So when more than a dozen strong earthquakes strike a single region in a morning, the threat is not just that any one of them is large, it is that together they batter the same structures over and over, and the cumulative punishment can bring down what a single shock would have spared. On a fault that sits beside a city of nearly 200,000 people, that cumulative threat is exactly the kind of thing that keeps engineers and emergency planners awake. What makes a barrage like this so hard to read is that, from the inside, the beginning of a catastrophe and the end of a scare look almost identical. A dense cluster of strong aftershocks can be the sound of a fault settling back down after a moderate event, or it can be the restless prelude to something much larger, the geological equivalent of a crowd murmuring before the real noise begins. There is no label on the earthquakes themselves that tells you which one you are living through. The only way to even begin answering that question is to understand the fault these quakes are happening on, and to understand what that fault is capable of when it decides to fully let go. But before we go down into the machinery of the Earth, there was one more event that morning, one that happened just 60 seconds after the largest shock, and it briefly told a few million people along the Pacific that the sea itself might be coming for them. Part 3. The Warning That Fired. 1 minute after the largest earthquake, an alert went out across the North Pacific. At 7:06 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time, just 60 seconds after that magnitude 6.6 ruptured the seafloor, the tsunami warning system issued a warning for the region, centered out near the Commander Islands, that lonely scatter of land between Kamchatka and the Aleutians. For a stretch of time that morning, the official word was not reassurance. It was the single most frightening word the ocean sciences can broadcast: tsunami. Understand what that warning means and why it is woven into the same thread we have been following, because the timing tells you something important about how seriously this kind of event is taken. The system did not wait to see what the sea would do. It could not afford to. When a large, shallow earthquake strikes under the ocean, the people who run tsunami warning centres have only minutes, sometimes only seconds, to decide whether to tell coastal communities that a wall of water might be on its way. They cannot run a leisurely analysis. They take the size of the quake, its depth, its location under the sea, and they make a fast, cautious call, because the cost of staying silent and being wrong is measured in human lives. So the warning fired almost instantly, automatically, on the assumption that an earthquake this large and this shallow under the Pacific had every right to lift the ocean. And then something strange happened. Or rather, something strange did not happen. The wave did not come. There was no destructive tsunami. The sea, by every measure that matters, stayed essentially flat. The earthquake records for these events carry a quiet little marker indicating that no damaging wave was observed. So we are left with a genuinely unsettling picture, and it is a picture that sits right at the centre of tonight's question. A pair of major earthquakes broke the Pacific seafloor 60 seconds apart. An emergency tsunami warning went out to coastlines around the Northern Ocean, and then the water did nothing. How do you square those two facts? How do you have an earthquake violent enough to trigger a tsunami warning, and then no tsunami? The answer to that question is not that the warning was a mistake, and this is a point worth slowing down on, because it is easy to draw the wrong lesson. A warning that fires without a wave is not a false alarm in the way people usually mean it. It is the system working exactly as designed, choosing caution over certainty when there is no time to wait for certainty. But the fuller answer, the satisfying one, lies in the physics of how earthquakes move water, and that physics turns out to depend on details most people never consider. It depends on how far below the seafloor the rupture was. It depends on which direction the ground actually moved, whether it heaved upward or slid sideways. We're going to take those details apart later, because they are the difference between a quiet night and a drowned coastline, and on this fault that difference is not theoretical. Let me take you inside the minutes after a large undersea earthquake, because the speed of that tsunami warning is not a small thing, and understanding it changes how you read the whole morning. When the seafloor ruptures, the seismic waves race outward through the solid earth far faster than any wave can move through water. Those seismic waves reach the global network of sensors within minutes, sometimes within a couple of minutes, and that is the warning system's entire advantage. The shaking outpaces the sea. So the people and the automated systems running tsunami warnings get a brief, precious head start, a window in which they know a large quake has happened under the ocean, but the water has not yet had time to travel. In that window, they must decide whether to sound the alarm, and they must decide it with incomplete information, because the full picture of what the fault did simply is not available yet. That is the impossible position the Kamchatka event put them in at 6 minutes past 7 that morning. Understand the arithmetic of that decision, because it explains why caution is not weakness, but wisdom. If a warning centre waits for certainty before issuing a warning, the wait itself can be fatal, because a tsunami from a nearby source can reach the closest coast in mere minutes. For the communities right along the Kamchatka coast, or out on the Commander Islands near where the warning was centred, there is almost no margin at all, so the system is deliberately tuned to ER toward warning. It would rather tell people to move and be wrong than stay silent and be right too late. When you frame it that way, the warning that fired off Kamchatka and then stood down is not a glitch or an overreaction. It is a system doing precisely the humane, rational thing it was built to do, accepting the cost of occasional unnecessary warnings as the price of never missing a real one. There is a genuine danger lurking in that trade-off, though, and it is worth naming honestly because it connects to how the public absorbs events like this. Every time a warning fires and no wave arrives, there is a risk that people learn the wrong lesson, that they begin to treat warnings as background noise, as the boy who cried wolf. That erosion of trust is one of the quiet hazards of living near a dangerous coast, and it is exactly why explaining the why matters so much. A warning followed by a flat sea is not proof that warnings are pointless. It is proof that the physics of that particular earthquake happened to spare the coast, and that the next earthquake on the same fault might not. The people who run these systems live in fear of the day a real wave is coming, and a jaded public ignores the alarm because the last several were stood down. So the honest framing of the Kamchatka warning is not that the system overreacted. It is that the system worked, and that the ocean, this time, simply did not cooperate with the worst case. And that is the strangeness I keep coming back to, the two faces of a single morning sitting side by side. On one side, the violence, a doublet, a barrage of aftershocks, an automated alarm screaming across the North Pacific that a wave might be coming. On the other side, the silence, a sea that stayed flat, a warning quietly stood down, a coastline untouched. Both of those things are true, and both of them are about the same fault, on the same morning, in the same water. The temptation is to let the calm ending wash away the alarm of the beginning, to file the whole thing under false alarm and move on. But that would be exactly the wrong lesson, because the calm ending was not a promise. It was a coin landing heads on a fault that has, within living memory, landed tails in the most catastrophic way imaginable. It is worth remembering how recent this ability to warn at all actually is, because it reframes the flat sea as something other than luck. For most of human history, a great undersea earthquake gave no warning whatsoever. The first sign of a tsunami was the sea itself, withdrawing strangely from the shore and then returning as a wall of water, with no time to do anything but run. The system that fired off Kamchatka within a single minute represents a genuine hard-won triumph over that ancient helplessness, a web of sensors and analysis and communication that can, in the best cases, give coastal communities precious minutes that their ancestors never had. So the morning's contradiction is, in a sense, a luxury of the modern age. We were able to be warned and then reassured, to watch the danger appear and then recede, all in real time. That is not something to take for granted, even when the wave does not come, because the same system that cried out unnecessarily this time is the same one that will, someday, cry out when it counts. For now, hold on to the contradiction, because it is the engine of everything that follows. The same morning gave us two faces of the same fault. One face was the violence, the doublet and the barrage and the warning, the ground announcing in the loudest possible terms that it was awake and moving. The other face was the silence of the sea afterward, the strange mercy of a wave that never arrived. The people who study this part of the world do not find that mercy comforting. They find it instructive, because they know that the very same fault in the very same water has already shown what it can do when all of those hidden details line up the other way. To understand why a doublet here makes scientists nervous in a way that a doublet somewhere else might not, you have to understand the machine beneath Kamchatka, the slow, relentless engine that has been building toward catastrophe for longer than any of us have been alive. Part 4. The engine beneath Kamchatka. Underneath that stretch of ocean, two of the planet's tectonic plates are locked in a collision that never stops. The Kamchatka Peninsula sits at the meeting point of the Pacific Plate and the slab of crust that carries northeastern Asia, and the relationship between them is not a friendly one. The Pacific Plate is diving downward, sliding underneath the edge of Asia, plunging into the hot interior of the Earth along a boundary called the Kuril-Kamchatka subduction zone. This is the machine that built the volcanoes of Kamchatka, and it is the same machine that produced the earthquakes we have been talking about. To understand why a doublet here is so unnerving, you have to understand how this machine actually works. Picture two enormous slabs of rock pressed against each other, one trying to slide beneath the other. They do not move smoothly. The Pacific Plate is creeping downward at a rate of roughly 80 millimeters a year, about the speed your fingernails grow, which sounds almost gentle until you remember the scale. These are slabs of solid rock the size of continents, and they do not glide. They catch. The two plates lock together along their contact surface snagged by friction, and they stay locked, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. But the 80 millimeters a year of motion does not stop just because the plates are stuck. The engine far below keeps pushing, so the rock bends. It stores the strain, like a steel spring being slowly, relentlessly wound tighter, year after year after year, and then, in a few violent seconds, the lock breaks. The stored strain releases all at once, and the ground lurches forward to catch up on everything it could not move while it was stuck. That lurch is an earthquake. This is why subduction zones produce the largest earthquakes on the planet, and why the one off Kamchatka belongs in a category of its own. The contact surface between the two plates, the part that locks and releases, is gigantic. It can be hundreds of kilometers long and tens of kilometers wide, and when a large enough section of it lets go at once, the amount of energy released is almost beyond comprehension. The Kuril-Kamchatka zone is one of the most productive earthquake factories anywhere, a place that generates great quakes with a regularity that would terrify anyone who looked at the record closely. So when more than a dozen strong earthquakes, including a doublet of major shocks, suddenly fire off along this exact boundary in a single morning, it is not background noise. It is the machine reminding everyone that it is still loaded, still pushing, still winding the spring. Let me show you what happens to the Pacific plate as it dives, because the fate of that descending slab is what powers everything above it. As the cold, dense oceanic plate plunges beneath Asia, it does not simply disappear. It drags downward into the hot interior, and as it sinks, it heats up, it bends, and it pulls on everything attached to it. That pull is part of what keeps the whole conveyor moving. Meanwhile, the upper part of the boundary, the part closest to the surface where the two plates are pressed together, is where the danger to humans concentrates. That shallow contact, often called the seismogenic zone, is the stretch that locks and stores strain and then breaks in great earthquakes. It is tens of kilometers wide and can run for hundreds of kilometers along the margin, and the larger the locked patch that fails at once, the larger the earthquake. The Kamchatka events struck in and around this critical zone, which is exactly why they command attention rather than being filed away as ordinary background grumbling from far below. Picture the locked boundary not as a single uniform surface, but as a patchwork, because this detail explains both doublets and the worst-case scenarios. Some parts of the contact are slippery and creep along quietly, releasing their motion in a smooth, aseismic crawl that never produces a large quake. Other parts are stuck fast, snagged on rough patches that geologists sometimes call asperities, and these are the troublemakers. An asperity holds, and holds, and holds, accumulating strain for decades or centuries while the smooth areas around it creep, until finally the asperity gives way in a violent rupture. When one asperity breaks, it can transfer its load onto the next stuck patch, and if that neighbour is already near failure, it breaks too. That is the mechanical core of a doublet. The first Kamchatka rupture very plausibly broke one stuck patch and shoved its burden onto a neighbouring one that was primed and ready, which then failed 60 seconds later and larger. The fault, in other words, showed us its patchwork and showed us that the patches are talking to each other. Consider how much energy this machine can bank before it pays out, because that is the number that should make you sit up. At roughly 80 millimeters a year of plate motion, a locked patch that has not broken in a century has stored up something like 8 meters of pent-up slip, 8 meters of motion that the rock wanted to make but could not because it was stuck. When such a patch finally lets go, all of that stored slip can be released in seconds, the seafloor lurching meters in a single convulsion. Multiply that across a locked zone hundreds of kilometers long, and you arrive at the almost unimaginable energy of a great subduction earthquake. This is why the Kuril-Kamchatka boundary is not just active but capable of the very largest events the planet produces. The machine has a high ceiling, and the higher the ceiling, the more consequential it is when the fault starts behaving unusually, the way it did with this doublet. You can actually see the evidence of this machine standing above the waterline in the form of Kamchatka's volcanoes. The peninsula is crowned with dozens of them, some of the most active on Earth, and they are not a coincidence sitting next to the earthquakes. They are made by the same engine. As the Pacific slab descends, it carries water and minerals down with it, and at a certain depth that water is cooked out of the rock, lowering the melting point of the material above and generating magma that rises to build the volcanic chain. So the volcanoes and the Megathrust earthquakes are two products of a single process, two symptoms of the same relentless subduction. When you look at a photograph of Kamchatka's smoking peaks, you are looking at the surface expression of the exact machine that produced the doublet, a terrain built entirely by the collision we have been describing. It helps to understand what makes one subduction zone more dangerous than another, because not all of them are equal, and the Kuril-Kamchatka boundary sits near the top of the list. Several factors govern how large a megathrust can go. The age and temperature of the descending plate matter, because a cold, old slab like the Pacific plate is dense and behaves in ways that favour large locked ruptures. The speed of subduction matters, because faster convergence loads strain more quickly. The geometry of the contact matters, because a long, smoothly dipping interface can fail across an enormous area at once. The Kuril-Kamchatka zone checks the dangerous boxes. It subducts an old, fast-moving plate along a lengthy, well-developed boundary, and the historical record confirms the consequence. This is one of the planet's most reliable producers of great earthquakes. So when this specific machine generates an unusual sequence, the worst-case ceiling is not a modest one. It is among the highest anywhere on Earth. There is a reason the term Megathrust carries such weight, and it is worth making it vivid. The largest earthquakes ever recorded by human instruments have all been megathrust earthquakes on subduction zones, the only kind of fault on the planet capable of reaching the very top of the magnitude scale. A continental fault that slips sideways, however dangerous to the city sitting on it, simply cannot store and release the amount of energy that a great subduction rupture can, because it does not have the enormous locked contact area that a megathrust has. This is why the conversation about Kamchatka is fundamentally a conversation about the upper limit of geological violence. The fault that produced this week's doublet belongs to the only category of fault that can produce a magnitude 9, and it has already done so once. That membership is the entire reason a doublet here is treated with a seriousness that the same doublet elsewhere would never receive. And here is the connection back to our central question, the one that has been sitting under everything since the first 60 seconds. A doublet on a fault like this is frightening precisely because of what this machine is capable of producing. On a small, gentle fault, 2 moderate earthquakes might mean very little. On the Kuril-Kamchatka megathrust, the upper end of what the machine can do is not a magnitude 6 or 7. It is far, far larger. And the only way to truly feel the weight of that statement is to look at the one time, within the memory of people still alive today, when this exact fault stopped winding the spring and let the whole thing go at once. Part 5. The Day. This fault drowned the Pacific. In November of 1952, this fault did the thing everyone is quietly afraid of. On the 4th of November, 1952, the Kamchatka megathrust ruptured along an immense stretch of its length and produced an earthquake of magnitude 9.0. Let that number settle for a moment, because it is hard to hold in the mind. A magnitude 9.0 is not simply a large earthquake. It is one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded by human instruments in all of history. A release of energy so enormous that it is difficult to compare it to anything in ordinary experience. And it happened right here, on the same boundary that produced this week's doublet, in the same water off the same peninsula. What that earthquake did next is the reason its name still matters, and the reason it haunts every conversation about Kamchatka. It generated a tsunami, and that tsunami did not stay home. The wave radiated outward across the entire Pacific Ocean. It struck the nearby Kuril Islands with devastating force, where the town of Severokurilsk was overwhelmed by the sea, and a large number of people lost their lives in a single catastrophic morning. But the water did not stop there. It raced across thousands of kilometers of open ocean at the speed of a jetliner and slammed into the Hawaiian Islands, on the far side of the Pacific, where it tore boats from their moorings and flooded low-lying shores. An earthquake off the coast of Russia reached out and touched Hawaii. That is what this fault is capable of when the hidden details line up the wrong way. This is the shadow that falls over the entire story we're telling tonight, and it is why the people who watch Kamchatka never fully relax. When seismologists look at a doublet and a barrage of aftershocks on the Kuril-Kamchatka zone, they are not imagining some abstract worst case pulled from a textbook. They are remembering 1952. They are remembering that this specific machine, this specific boundary, has already demonstrated that it can produce a magnitude 9 and send a killing wave across the widest ocean on Earth. So the question that runs underneath the whole day is not whether such a thing is possible here. The record already answered that. The question is whether what we just witnessed is connected to such a thing, or whether it is simply the fault grumbling well short of its terrifying ceiling. Now, I want to be careful and honest with you here, because it would be easy to slide from history into fear-mongering, and that is not what this is. The overwhelming likelihood, by every statistical measure we have, is that this week's sequence is not the beginning of another 1952. Most earthquakes, even big ones, even doublets, are not the opening act of a magnitude 9. The point of remembering 1952 is not to predict a repeat. The point is to explain why the stakes here are so asymmetric, why a sequence that would be a minor curiosity somewhere else becomes something scientists feel compelled to watch closely when it happens on this particular fault. The history does not tell us what will happen. It tells us why the people who know this region best cannot afford to look away. Let me walk you through how that 1952 wave actually travelled, because the physics of it is what makes this fault's reach so frightening. A tsunami in the open ocean is not the towering wall people imagine. It is a long, low swell, often only a metre or two high in the open ocean, but stretched over a wavelength of hundreds of kilometres and moving at the speed of a jet aircraft, around 800 kilometres an hour across the open Pacific. It carries an enormous amount of energy, and because it moves so fast and so smoothly, a ship out at sea might not even notice it pass beneath the hull. The danger reveals itself only when that energy reaches shallow water near a coast. There the front of the wave slows, the water behind it piles up, and the swell that was barely noticeable in the open ocean rears up into the devastating surge that floods the shore. In 1952, that process played out across the entire Pacific basin, the energy of a single Kamchatka rupture radiating outward in every direction like ripples from a stone, except the pond was the largest ocean on Earth. Follow that wave to its destinations, because the geography of where it struck is the whole reason this history matters for a city like Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky today. The nearest coasts had almost no warning at all. The Kuril Islands, just to the south of Kamchatka, were hit within minutes, and the town of Severokurilsk was overwhelmed by the sea, with a large number of lives lost in a single morning, a tragedy that reshaped how the region thinks about tsunami risk. But the energy kept going. Hours later, after crossing thousands of kilometres of open water, the wave reached the Hawaiian Islands on the far side of the Pacific, where it caused damage to boats, piers, and low-lying shores. Sit with that fact for a moment. An earthquake off the coast of Russia sent a wave that was still dangerous when it arrived in Hawaii most of a day later. That is the kind of reach that belongs to only a handful of faults on the entire planet, and the Kamchatka Megathrust is one of them. Understand that 1952 was not a freak one-time accident, because that is the detail that turns history into a live concern. This margin has produced great earthquakes repeatedly across the historical and geological record. The Kuril-Kamchatka boundary is one of the most reliable producers of large subduction earthquakes anywhere, generating major events on a rhythm measured in decades. The locked patches break, accumulate strain again over the following decades, and break again. That recurring rhythm is why scientists speak of seismic cycles, and it is why a place can be quiet for a generation, and then suddenly, violently, repay everything at once. The peninsula has lived this cycle over and over, so when the fault produces an unusual sequence like this week's Doublet, it does so against a backdrop of a boundary that everyone who studies it knows is fully capable of, and historically prone to, the largest class of earthquakes Earth can make. Let me add one more layer to the 1952 story, because the way the wave behaved that day is a lesson in itself. The communities closest to the rupture had essentially no warning, struck within minutes by water that gave no time to react. The places thousands of kilometres away, by contrast, had hours, because the wave, fast as it was, still needed time to cross the ocean. That difference, between the near coast and the far coast, is the entire reason modern warning systems can work at all for distant shores, while being almost useless for the nearest ones. It is also why the single most important protection for a place like Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky is not a distant warning centre at all, but the instinct of its own residents to treat violent shaking as the signal to move. The 1952 wave taught that lesson in the hardest possible way, and it is a lesson that travels directly into the present, into exactly the kind of morning this fault just produced. I want to be precise about what this history does and does not tell us, because the line between context and fear-mongering is exactly the line this channel tries to walk honestly. The 1952 earthquake does not mean another magnitude 9 is coming this week. It does not mean the Doublet was a foreshock to a great quake. The history is not a prediction, and anyone who uses 1952 to tell you that catastrophe is imminent is misusing it. What the history does tell us is why the stakes are shaped the way they are. It tells us that the worst case for this fault is not some abstract theoretical maximum dreamed up in a model. It is a real event that really happened, in this water, within the lifetime of people still living, and it crossed an ocean to do its damage. That is what makes a small probability here so heavy. The bad outcome is not imaginary. It has a date. Let me connect that history directly to the city sitting in the line of fire today, because this is where the past stops being a story and becomes a stake. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky did not exist in 1952 the way it exists now. The region holds far more people, far more buildings, far more of everything that a great earthquake and its wave could touch than it did when the fault last fully let go. Decades of relative calm have allowed a modern population to settle in above a boundary that has not shown them its worst in their lifetimes. That is the quiet trap of a long seismic cycle. The longer the fault stays quiet, the more there is to lose when it finally moves, and the more people there are who have never personally felt why the old warnings exist. So when this fault produces a violent doublet and a tsunami warning, it is not only repeating an old pattern, it is repeating it over a coastline that has far more at stake now than it did the last time the Megathrust reminded everyone what it could do. So we are left with the real question, the one that the doublet forced into the open the moment that second earthquake struck 60 seconds after the first. If this fault can do what it did in 1952, then what does it mean when it suddenly produces 2 major quakes in a minute and more than a dozen strong ones in a morning? Is that the fault relieving pressure and stepping back from the edge, or is it the fault loading the next section, the way the first quake may have loaded the second? To even begin answering that, we have to talk about what a doublet really is, and about the small, sobering number that sits behind every large earthquake on Earth. Part 6. What a doublet really means. Every large earthquake carries a hidden possibility that almost no one outside the field ever hears about. When a major earthquake strikes, there is a small but real chance that it is not the main event at all, but a foreshock, a warning tremor that precedes an even larger earthquake still to come. Seismologists have studied this across the global record, and the number they arrive at is sobering in its quiet way. Any given large earthquake has roughly a few % chance of being followed by something bigger within the next days. A few %. Small enough that it almost never happens, large enough that it can never be ignored, and a doublet 2 major quakes back to back is the scenario where that small number stops feeling abstract. Here is the logic that makes a doublet so important, and it connects directly to the machine we just described. When that first magnitude 6.0 struck off Kamchatka, and the magnitude 6.6 followed. 60 seconds later, the most natural reading is that the first rupture changed the stress on the surrounding rock and pushed the next section past its breaking point. This is a real, well-documented process. Earthquakes redistribute stress. When one patch of a fault slips, it does not simply relieve pressure everywhere. It loads some neighbouring patches even more heavily, the way removing one jammed log from a logjam can suddenly throw the entire weight of the river against the next one. So a doublet is direct, visible evidence that the earthquakes out there are talking to each other, that one rupture is capable of provoking the next. And the unavoidable question that follows is whether that conversation is finished. This is the exact reason scientists are nervous, and it is worth saying plainly rather than dancing around it. The doublet proves that stress transfer is actively happening on this fault right now. The first quake triggered the second. The second was larger than the first. In most cases, the sequence then peters out, the aftershocks fade, and the fault goes quiet for years. But the doublet has demonstrated in real time that this section of the Kuril-Kamchatka zone is capable of having one rupture set off another, larger one. So when seismologists watch the barrage of aftershocks that followed, they are not just counting tremors, they are watching to see whether the stress is settling or whether it is still being passed along, hunting for the next weak point. The honest truth is that, in the first hours and days, you genuinely cannot be certain which way it will go. I want to give you the tools to think about this the way the experts do, because the uncertainty is not the same as having no information. There are patterns that govern how earthquake sequences behave, statistical regularities that hold up remarkably well across thousands of events worldwide. These patterns do not let anyone predict the exact next earthquake, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling something. But they do let scientists put real numbers on the odds, to say with some confidence whether a sequence is behaving like a normal aftershock decay or like something more ominous. Those patterns are the closest thing we have to reading the fault's intentions, and they are what the monitoring centres leaned on in the hours after the Kamchatka doublet. Let me explain the cruelest feature of the word foreshock, because it is the reason this uncertainty cannot be wished away. A foreshock is only a foreshock in hindsight. At the moment it happens, a foreshock looks exactly like a main shock. There is no special signature, no distinctive sound, no marker in the data that says this one is merely the warning. The real event is still coming. The label can only be applied after the larger earthquake arrives and demotes everything before it to the status of prelude. This is the trap that sits underneath every large earthquake on a dangerous fault. When the magnitude 6.6 struck off Kamchatka, there was no way in that moment to know whether it was the main event or the second movement of something still building. Only time could tell, and time in the first hours had not yet spoken. History has handed us sobering examples of exactly this trap, and one of them looms over every conversation about subduction zones. Before the catastrophic magnitude 9 earthquake that struck off Japan in 2011, the fault produced a substantial foreshock, a magnitude 7.3, a couple of days earlier. At the time, that magnitude 7.3 was treated as a significant earthquake in its own right, which it was. Nobody watching it could know that it was the opening note of one of the most devastating earthquakes and tsunamis of the modern era. Only after the Great Quake struck did the earlier event reveal itself as a foreshock. That is the haunting precedent that sits in the back of every seismologist's mind when a strong earthquake hits a major subduction zone and is followed by more strong earthquakes. It is not that they expect the worst. It is that they know the worst has, on rare and terrible occasions, announced itself in exactly this way, and looked completely ordinary while doing so. Understand the mechanism that makes this possible, because it is real physics, not superstition, and it ties directly to the doublet we started with. When a fault ruptures, it redistributes stress in the surrounding crust in a calculable way. Some areas have their stress relieved and are made less likely to fail, but other areas, often just beyond the ends of the rupture, have stress added to them, pushed closer to their own breaking point. Scientists can actually map these zones of increased and decreased stress after a major earthquake. If a heavily loaded patch happens to sit next to a region that was already near failure, the earthquake can act as the final straw, triggering the neighbour. That is precisely what a doublet demonstrates in real time. The Kamchatka sequence did not just hint that stress transfer is possible here, it proved it by producing a second major rupture 60 seconds after the first. And once you know the stress is actively being passed along the fault, the question of where it stops becomes the only question that matters. So let me state the probability honestly, because the honesty is the point. The chance that any given large earthquake is a foreshock to something bigger is small, commonly placed in the range of a few percent in the days that follow. For the overwhelming majority of large earthquakes, nothing bigger comes, and the sequence simply decays. If you had to bet, you would always bet that the Kamchatka doublet was the main event and that the aftershocks would fade. But a few percent is not zero, and on a fault that has produced a magnitude 9 within living memory, a few percent of that outcome is a number with enormous weight behind it. This is the exact calculation running underneath the title of this video. Scientists are nervous not because they expect catastrophe, but because they cannot rule it out in the early hours, and the thing they cannot rule out is the thing that crosses oceans. That gap between the likely and the certain is where they were forced to work that morning. Let me underline one more time why the doublet specifically, and not just the size of the quakes, is what unsettles the experts, because this is the hinge of the whole story. A lone magnitude 6.6 off Kamchatka would have been a serious but fairly ordinary event for this fault, the kind of thing that happens on subduction zones with grim regularity. What changed the emotional temperature was the proof of communication between ruptures. The fact that the first quake was followed 60 seconds later by a larger one is direct evidence that, on this patch of the Megathrust, on this particular day, a slip in one place could provoke a slip in another. That is the property that turns an isolated earthquake into a potential chain, and a chain is the only way you get from an ordinary large quake to a great one, because the great megathrust events are in a sense chains that did not stop, ruptures that kept recruiting neighbouring patches until an enormous length of fault had failed together. The doublet showed the recruiting mechanism switched on. The question that hung in the air was simply whether it would switch off in time, because make no mistake about what was happening behind the scenes that morning. While the aftershocks were still arriving, while the tsunami warning was being evaluated and stood down, scientists were already feeding the data into the frameworks that turn a chaotic swarm of tremors into a probability. Is this sequence decaying on schedule, or is it running hot? Is the largest aftershock where it should be, or is it too big, hinting at more stored energy than expected? Those are answerable questions, at least in terms of odds, and the answers are what separate informed watchfulness from blind panic. So let us go inside those tools, the laws of aftershocks, and see what the numbers were actually whispering about Kamchatka. Part 7. Reading the aftershocks. There are a handful of mathematical patterns that earthquakes obey, and they are the closest thing seismology has to a crystal ball. They are not magic, and they are not prediction in the way most people imagine it. But these patterns describe how aftershock sequences behave with enough reliability that scientists can use them to judge, in the hours after a big quake, whether what they are watching is normal or alarming. 3 of them matter for understanding Kamchatka, and once you know them, you will never look at an aftershock report the same way again. They are the quiet framework that experts were running in their heads, while the ground off the peninsula kept breaking. The first is a rule about how aftershocks fade with time. After a main shock, the aftershocks come fast and frequent at first, then taper off, and they do so in a predictable way, with the rate of aftershocks dropping roughly in proportion to the time that has passed. An hour after a big quake, you get many. A day later, far fewer. A week later, fewer still. This is why the dense barrage off Kamchatka in the first hours was, in one sense, exactly what you would expect. A major earthquake produces a flood of early aftershocks. The pattern told scientists that the high rate in those opening hours was not, by itself, a sign of doom. It was the normal opening behaviour of a disturbed fault. The real information would come from whether the sequence faded on schedule or refused to. The second pattern concerns the size of the largest aftershock, and this is where the Kamchatka sequence had a detail worth flagging. There is a well-established tendency for the biggest aftershock to come in at roughly 1 to 1 1/4 magnitude units below the main shock, more or less regardless of how big the main shock was. For a magnitude 6.6 main shock, that rule of thumb predicts a largest aftershock somewhere around magnitude 5.4 or 5.5. Now recall what actually happened off Kamchatka. The sequence produced a magnitude 5.8, late and large. That is a touch bigger than the simple rule would expect, and while it is not wildly out of bounds, it is precisely the kind of small deviation that makes a careful seismologist raise an eyebrow. A largest aftershock running hot can hint that the fault holds more energy than the main shock alone would suggest, which loops directly back to our central worry about whether the sequence was truly winding down. The third pattern is the most fundamental of all, and it is the one that quietly demolishes a lot of the fear that circulates online. Across the entire planet, earthquakes follow a strict relationship between size and frequency. For every step down in magnitude, earthquakes become roughly 10 times more common. There are a handful of magnitude 8s in a typical year, a few hundred magnitude 5s every month, and tens of thousands of magnitude 3s that almost no one notices. This relationship is so consistent that when scientists see a swarm of earthquakes, they can check whether the mix of sizes looks normal or distorted. The Kamchatka sequence, for all its violence, had the shape of a large main shock with a normal cascade of smaller events beneath it, which is reassuring in the sense that it did not look like some exotic, never-before-seen phenomenon. It looked like a powerful, ordinary, terrifying subduction zone sequence. Let me make these patterns concrete, because they are not abstract equations to a working seismologist. They are a forecast, updated by the hour. The first pattern, the one about how aftershocks fade with time, lets scientists put an actual number on what to expect next. If a fault has produced a certain number of aftershocks in the first 6 hours, the pattern predicts roughly how many to expect in the next 6, and the next day, and the next week. When the observed aftershocks track that prediction, it is reassuring, a sign the sequence is behaving normally and winding down on schedule. When they run ahead of the prediction, refusing to slow, that is a flag. Off Kamchatka, the dense early barrage was high, but a high early rate is exactly what the pattern predicts after a large main shock. The real test was whether the rate would fall off in the following hours the way the mathematics said it should. Consider what the second pattern, the one about the size of the largest aftershock, actually rules out, because that is where its power lies. The tendency for the biggest aftershock to fall roughly a magnitude or so below the main shock is not a guarantee, but it is a strong central expectation, and it gives scientists a yardstick. If the largest aftershock starts creeping up toward the size of the main shock itself, that is a serious warning that the situation may be escalating rather than settling, because it suggests the energy being released is not tapering. Off Kamchatka, the magnitude 5.8 aftershock sat a bit higher than the simple rule would predict for a magnitude 6.6 main shock, and while that is not alarming on its own, it nudged the assessment toward the cautious end. It was one more small reason to keep watching rather than to relax, one more hint that this particular fault was holding more in reserve than a textbook sequence would. The third pattern, the strict relationship between earthquake size and frequency, does something subtle but vital. It lets scientists check whether a sequence is internally normal, whether the ratio of small to large events looks like ordinary seismicity or like something distorted. A swarm with too many large events relative to small ones, or some other strange imbalance, can hint at unusual processes, such as fluid movement or magma, rather than a standard tectonic rupture. The Kamchatka sequence had the ordinary shape of a powerful main shock, with a normal cascade of smaller aftershocks beneath it, which actually argued against any exotic explanation, and in favour of a straightforward, if violent, subduction zone event. That normalcy is a strange kind of comfort. It meant the fault was doing a terrifying thing in an entirely predictable way, which is at least a thing the science knows how to track. What I want you to take from these three tools is that uncertainty is not the same as ignorance, and this distinction is the whole reason scientists can be nervous without being panicked. The patterns do not let anyone name the next earthquake, but they convert a frightening, chaotic morning into a set of odds that can be monitored and updated, a running assessment of whether the fault is calming down or staying dangerous. That is the machinery behind the careful, measured language you hear from official sources after an event like this. The language that can sound frustratingly non-committal until you understand that it is the honest output of exactly these calculations. The scientists watching Kamchatka were not guessing. They were running the numbers, and the numbers were telling a story with a most likely ending and a small, stubborn tale of danger that would not quite close. It is worth appreciating just how hard-won these patterns are, because they did not come easily, and they are not guesses. They emerge from more than a century of patiently cataloguing earthquakes around the world, of recording sequence after sequence and noticing that, beneath the apparent chaos, the same regularities kept appearing. An aftershock sequence in one country behaves, statistically, much like one on the far side of the planet. The size relationships hold across wildly different faults and settings. That universality is what gives the patterns their power, because it means a scientist watching the Kamchatka sequence is not starting from scratch. They are comparing it against the distilled behaviour of thousands of past sequences, asking whether this one is typical or an outlier. The overwhelming majority of the time, even violent sequences turn out to be statistically typical, which is genuinely reassuring. The rare exceptions are exactly what the watching is designed to catch. Let me also be clear about what these tools cannot do, because their limits are as important as their powers, and they explain the careful wording of official statements. The patterns describe the behaviour of sequences in aggregate as probabilities. They cannot tell you that a specific earthquake will or will not happen at a specific time. They can say that the chance of a larger event in the coming days is, for example, low and falling, but they cannot drop that chance to a clean zero, and they cannot promise that the unlikely will not occur. So when scientists relied on these tools after the Kamchatka doublet, they were not extracting certainty from them, because certainty is not on offer. They were extracting odds, and then watching to see whether reality tracked the odds or departed from them. That is the honest shape of the work, and it is why the public messaging around such events is so carefully hedged. The hedging is not evasion. It is precision about the genuine limits of what can be known. So put those three tools together and you can feel what the scientists were feeling. The early flood of aftershocks was normal, the seismics was normal, but the largest aftershock was running slightly hot, and the whole thing was happening on the one fault that has produced a magnitude 9 within living memory. That combination is why the answer was not panic and was not dismissal. It was watchfulness, the careful, sleepless attention of people who know that the patterns give you odds, not certainties. And that brings us to the hardest part of the entire story, the question that all of these tools still cannot answer, the question that hangs over every doublet on a dangerous fault. Part 8. The question no one can answer. There is a limit to what even the best science can tell you in the moment, and that limit is the most honest thing in this entire story. With all the patterns, all the data, all the decades of accumulated knowledge about how earthquakes behave, scientists still cannot tell you, in the hours after a doublet, whether the sequence is ending or beginning. They can give you odds, they can tell you that the most likely outcome by far is that the aftershocks fade and life goes on. But they cannot promise it, and that gap between the likely and the certain is exactly where the dread lives. It is the same gap that opened the moment the second earthquake struck 60 seconds after the first. Let me be precise about the shape of this uncertainty, because precision is what separates honest reporting from fear. After the Kamchatka doublet, the situation was not unknowable. The statistical tools we just walked through gave a clear baseline reading. This looks like a powerful aftershock sequence that will most probably decay. At the same time, the foreshock possibility, that small few % chance that any large quake precedes a larger one, never fully goes to zero in the first days, and on a fault with the 1952 record, even a few % is a number you respect. So scientists were holding two truths at once: the overwhelming probability that this fades, and the small, stubborn, consequential probability that it does not. Holding both of those at the same time, without collapsing into either false calm or false alarm, is the actual job. This is why the word nervous, the word in the title, is the right word, and not a stronger one. Scientists were not predicting catastrophe off Kamchatka, and anyone telling you they were is not being truthful with you. But they were also not shrugging it off, because shrugging it off is not available to people who understand this fault. Nervous is the honest middle. Nervous is what you feel when the most likely outcome is fine, but the worst case is a magnitude 9 and a Pacific-wide tsunami, and you genuinely cannot rule the worst case out in the first hours. That is the emotional core of this whole event, and it is a far more interesting feeling than simple fear, because it is the feeling of looking directly at uncertainty and refusing to lie about it. I think there is something almost clarifying in sitting with that, rather than rushing past it to a tidy answer. We desperately want earthquakes to be predictable. We want someone to be able to say, "This is the last one, you are safe now," or "Evacuate, the big one is coming." The truth is that the Earth does not offer that kind of certainty, and the people who study it have made their peace with working in probabilities instead of promises. When you hear that scientists are watching a sequence closely, that is what it means. It does not mean they know something they are not telling you. It means they are doing the only thing the science actually allows, which is to track the odds in real time and stay ready to act if the odds shift. The Kamchatka doublet was a perfect, unsettling demonstration of exactly that. Let me be blunt about the history of earthquake prediction, because it is a history of disappointment, and that disappointment is the reason scientists speak in odds rather than promises. For decades, researchers chased the dream of true prediction, the ability to say a specific earthquake would strike a specific place at a specific time. They looked for precursors, telltale signs that might precede a quake, changes in groundwater, swarms of small tremors, shifts in the electrical properties of rocks, even the famous reports of animals behaving strangely. One of the most famous experiments set out to catch a predicted earthquake at a well-studied spot in California, with instruments waiting in place for the event everyone was sure would come on schedule. The earthquake showed up more than a decade late. Over and over, the precursors that looked promising in hindsight failed to work as reliable predictors in advance. The honest conclusion the field reached is hard but important. There is currently no proven method to predict the exact timing of a major earthquake. Understand what scientists do instead, because it is the thing that was actually happening off Kamchatka, and it is far more useful than the false certainty people often wish for. They practice forecasting, which is the language of probability rather than prophecy. A forecast does not say an earthquake will strike tomorrow. It says that, given the current sequence, there is a certain % chance of an event above a certain size in the coming days, and it updates that number as new data arrives. This is the same kind of reasoning used in weather forecasting, where no one expects a promise of rain at a precise minute, only a well-grounded probability. After the Kamchatka doublet, the forecast was a living number, recalculated as each aftershock arrived, expressing the odds that the sequence would escalate versus fade. That number was the real product of all the monitoring, and it was almost certainly weighted heavily toward fading, with a small, persistent chance of something worse that simply would not drop to zero in the early hours. Sit with the psychology of that for a moment, because it is genuinely hard for human beings to hold, and it explains why events like this generate so much anxiety and misinformation. Our minds crave a clean answer. We want to be told either that we are safe or that we are in danger, and we find the in-between almost unbearable. But the in-between is exactly where the truth lives after an event like the Kamchatka doublet. The most likely outcome is that everything is fine. The worst outcome is a catastrophe. Both are true at once, and neither can be dismissed. People who cannot tolerate that ambiguity tend to flee to one of two false comforts, either insisting that nothing is happening and it is all overblown, or insisting that the big one is imminent and the authorities are hiding it. Both of those are easier to hold than the honest middle, and both of them are wrong. The honest middle is uncertainty, managed with care, and that, in the end, is why the word in the title is nervous and not terrified, and why that distinction is not just word choice, but the entire ethic of how this should be reported. To be terrified would be to claim knowledge of a catastrophe that the data does not support. To be dismissive would be to ignore a real, if small, danger on a fault with a horrifying track record. Nervous is the precise emotional coordinate between those two errors. It is the feeling of a person who understands the odds, respects the worst case, and refuses to pretend the uncertainty away in either direction. The scientists watching Kamchatka were nervous in exactly that disciplined sense, and so should we be, because nervous is what clear-eyed people feel when they are looking honestly at a small chance of a very large disaster. I think it is worth saying plainly why honest uncertainty is more valuable to you than false confidence, because the temptation to demand a simple answer is strong, and it leads people badly astray. When a source tells you, with total certainty, that a catastrophe is imminent, it is either guessing or manipulating you, because the science does not support that certainty. When a source tells you, with equal certainty, that there is absolutely nothing to worry about, it is making the opposite error, ignoring a real if small danger. Both of those false certainties are easier to sell than the truth, because both give you permission to stop thinking. The honest answer asks more of you. It asks you to hold a probability in your mind, to understand that the likely outcome is fine while the unlikely outcome is severe, and to act reasonably in the face of that tension. That is harder, but it is the only stance that respects both the facts and you. The whole point of walking through the doublet, the history and the statistics tonight is to equip you to hold that honest middle yourself, rather than being pushed toward one of the two comfortable lies. There is a quiet dignity in how the scientific community handles these moments, and it is worth admiring before we move on. Faced with a violent, ambiguous sequence on the most dangerous kind of fault, the people whose job it is to assess it did not panic the public and did not dismiss the threat. They issued the warning when caution demanded it, stood it down when the data allowed, and kept watching, communicating in the careful, probabilistic language that honestly reflects what they actually knew. That restraint is not weakness or indecision. It is a discipline, the discipline of telling the truth about uncertainty, even when a frightened audience would prefer a simple verdict. The Kamchatka doublet was, among other things, a demonstration of that discipline working as it should, and it is a model for how the rest of us might think about the unpredictable hazards we live alongside. But there was one more variable in this particular event that mattered enormously, one that helps explain both why the tsunami warning fired and why the wave never came. It is a variable that most people never think about when they picture an earthquake, and it is the difference between a quiet night and a drowned coastline. It is not how big the earthquake was, it is how far down it was, and which way the ground actually moved. And on the morning of June 19th, the data on that question did not even fully agree with itself. Part 9. Depth changes. Everything. The size of an earthquake is not what determines whether it drowns a coastline. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths in all of Earth science, and it sits at the center of why the Kamchatka tsunami warning fired and then stood down. Two earthquakes of identical magnitude can do completely different things to the ocean above them, and the difference comes down to two hidden factors: how far below the seafloor the rupture happened, and which direction the ground actually moved. Get those two things right and you can explain the strange mercy of that flat sea. Get them wrong, and the same fault becomes 1952 all over again. Start with depth, because the Kamchatka event handed us a genuine puzzle on exactly this point. To lift the ocean into a tsunami, an earthquake generally needs to be shallow, close enough to the seafloor that the violent motion of the rock actually displaces the water column above it. An earthquake far below the surface, one that ruptures well down inside the crust, spends much of its energy in the rock and arrives at the seafloor too muffled to heave the sea. Now here is the puzzle. For these Kamchatka quakes, different monitoring agencies reported genuinely different depths. One placed the main shocks only a few kilometers down, dangerously shallow, the kind of depth that justifies an instant tsunami warning. Another placed at least one of them several times farther down. That disagreement is not incompetence. It reflects how hard it is to pin down an earthquake's depth in the first frantic minutes using signals recorded thousands of kilometers away. But it means that even the basic question of how shallow these ruptures were did not have a single clean answer that morning, which is part of why the warning system, facing genuine uncertainty, chose caution. The second factor, the direction the ground moved, is where the real explanation for the missing wave most likely lives. Earthquakes break in different styles. In some, called thrust earthquakes, one block of crust is shoved up and over another, and the seafloor heaves vertically, lifting the entire water column above it and launching a tsunami. These are the great wave makers, and the megathrust earthquakes that subduction zones produce, including the 1952 monster, are exactly this type. But in other earthquakes, the ground mostly slides sideways, one block grinding horizontally past another. A sideways motion like that, even a violent one, barely disturbs the water above it, because shoving the sea sideways does not pile it up the way lifting it does. If the Kamchatka Doublet was dominated by that kind of sideways or oblique motion, rather than a clean vertical thrust, it would neatly explain how you can have major earthquakes, a tsunami warning, and yet a flat and harmless sea. And now you can see why this distinction is not academic, why it ties straight back to why scientists are nervous rather than calm. The reason the wave did not come this time may simply be that these particular ruptures did not lift the ocean enough, whether because they were a little farther down than the worst case, or because they moved more sideways than upward, or both. But that is a statement about these specific earthquakes, not about the fault as a whole. The same boundary, in a different rupture, with a clean vertical thrust on a shallow patch of the locked megathrust, is precisely the configuration that produces an ocean-crossing tsunami. The fault did not spare the Pacific because it is gentle. It spared the Pacific because this time the hidden details fell on the safe side of the knife edge. Next time, on this fault, there is no guarantee they will, and that single sentence is the reason a doublet here keeps people up at night. Let me show you how scientists actually figure out which way the ground moved, because it is a genuinely clever piece of detective work, and it is central to reading the missing wave. When an earthquake happens, the way it radiates energy in different directions carries the fingerprint of the fault motion that produced it. By comparing how the seismic waves arrived at instruments scattered all around the world, seismologists can reconstruct the geometry of the rupture, the orientation of the fault and the direction it slipped. They render this as a kind of diagram, and from it they can tell whether the earthquake was a vertical thrust, a sideways slip, or some mix of the two. This analysis takes a little time to finalize, which is part of why the very first minutes after a quake, the minutes when the tsunami warning has to be issued, are so fraught. The warning often has to go out before the full mechanism is even known, on the conservative assumption that a big shallow quake might be the wave-making kind. Compare two kinds of great earthquakes, and the difference becomes vivid because the planet has shown us both. The most devastating tsunamis of recent history were generated by enormous thrust earthquakes on subduction zones, where the seafloor was heaved upward across a huge area, lifting the entire ocean above it and sending walls of water toward distant shores. Those are the megathrust events, and the 1952 Kamchatka earthquake was exactly this type. But the planet has also produced gigantic earthquakes that generated almost no tsunami at all, because they were dominated by sideways motion. There have been earthquakes well above magnitude 8, where the ground mostly slid horizontally, and despite their staggering size, they did not raise a major ocean-crossing wave, because shoving the sea sideways does not pile it up the way lifting it does. The lesson is stark. A smaller thrust earthquake on a shallow patch can be far more dangerous to coastlines than a larger sideways one. Size alone does not decide it. Mechanism does. Apply that to the Kamchatka Doublet and the missing wave starts to make sense, which loops us straight back to the central tension of the morning. If those particular ruptures involved a significant component of sideways motion, or if they happened to be a little farther down than the worst case, or some combination of the two, then they could be major earthquakes that nonetheless failed to lift the ocean meaningfully. That would explain the warning and the flat sea in a single stroke, not as a contradiction but as a consequence of the specific geometry of these specific ruptures. The sea stayed calm because these earthquakes, whatever their violence, did not move the seafloor in the particular vertical way that breeds a tsunami. It was not luck in the sense of randomness, it was the physics of this rupture falling on the survivable side of the line. There is a humbling lesson buried in that depth disagreement, one that applies far beyond this single event. We tend to imagine that in the modern age, with all our instruments and satellites and computing power, the basic facts of a major event are known instantly and precisely. The reality is messier and more honest. In the first minutes after a great earthquake on the far side of the world, even something as fundamental as how far below the seafloor it happened can carry real uncertainty, because the measurement depends on untangling overlapping signals recorded thousands of kilometers away. The numbers get refined in the hours and days that follow, converging toward an agreed answer. But the warning had to be issued in the minutes, not the hours, which means it was issued in the fog. Understanding that fog is the key to judging the whole morning fairly. The people making the call were not careless or slow. They were fast and careful at the same time, making a defensible decision with the incomplete information that was all anyone could have had. And here is where the data quality wrinkle becomes more than a footnote, because it underscores how genuinely hard real-time science is. The fact that different agencies reported different depths for these earthquakes is not a sign that anyone was careless. It reflects the real difficulty of pinning down an earthquake's depth from a great distance in the first frantic minutes, when the analysis must be fast and the signals are still being gathered. Depth is one of the hardest parameters to nail down quickly, and yet it is one of the most important for judging tsunami potential. So the warning centers were making a life or death call with a key variable still genuinely uncertain, choosing caution precisely because they could not yet be sure how shallow the ruptures were. When you understand that, the warning that fired and then stood down looks less like a mistake and more like a careful decision made honestly under pressure, with incomplete information, on a fault where the cost of being wrong is measured in lives. Let me pull the depth and mechanism thread together with the warning, because together they resolve the central puzzle of the morning into something you can actually hold. The warning fired because in the first minute, all anyone knew was that a large, possibly shallow earthquake had struck under the Pacific, and that is enough to demand caution. The wave failed to materialize because, as the fuller picture came into focus, these particular ruptures did not displace the seafloor in the steep vertical way that launches a tsunami, whether due to their depth, their motion, or both. So the apparent contradiction dissolves. There was no contradiction at all, only a fast, cautious decision made before the details were known, followed by reality filling in the details on the survivable side of the ledger. That sequence is not a failure of the system. It is the system functioning exactly as intended, trading the small cost of an unnecessary warning for the priceless benefit of never being caught silent before a real wave, and it leaves the fault itself exactly where it was, capable of the other outcome on another day. So we have looked at the violence, the history, the statistics, and the physics, and a clear picture is formed. But there is another layer to this story, one that has nothing to do with the rock and everything to do with us, with how this kind of event gets understood, misunderstood, and twisted online the moment it happens. Because almost as soon as the Kamchatka earthquake struck, a familiar set of claims began to circulate, the same claims that follow every major quake, and they deserve a clear and honest answer before we close. Part 10. Is the Earth waking up? Every time a big earthquake makes the news, the same idea spreads within hours. The planet is becoming more active, the earthquakes are increasing, something is changing. It feels true, especially in a week like this one, when a violent doublet off Kamchatka lands on top of other strong quakes around the world. But it is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in all of Earth science, and clearing it up actually helps explain why the Kamchatka sequence is alarming, for the right reasons rather than the wrong ones. The data simply does not support the idea that great earthquakes are becoming more frequent. When you look at the long-term global record of the largest quakes, the rate has stayed remarkably steady across the decades. What has changed, and changed dramatically, is our ability to detect and report them. A century ago, an earthquake in a remote part of the ocean might have gone almost unrecorded, noticed only as a faint wiggle on a handful of instruments. Today, a global network of thousands of sensitive seismometers catches essentially everything, and the moment it happens, it is on your phone. So the apparent surge in earthquakes is, overwhelmingly, a surge in our awareness of them, not a surge in the Earth itself. The frequency and size relationship we discussed earlier holds steady year after year, and it leaves no room for a hidden global increase in great quakes. Look closely at why this illusion is so convincing, because the mechanism of the misunderstanding is itself revealing. A century ago, the global seismic network was sparse, and a great many earthquakes, especially those under the oceans or in remote regions, were detected weakly or missed entirely. Today there are thousands of sensitive instruments, linked in real time, feeding automated alerts straight to the phone in your pocket. So the apparent explosion in earthquake activity is, overwhelmingly, an explosion in detection and communication. We are not living through more earthquakes. We are living through more awareness of earthquakes, delivered faster and louder than ever before. Layer on top of that the way social media amplifies anything frightening, and you get a powerful, persistent impression of a planet spiraling out of control, even as the underlying rate of great earthquakes holds essentially steady. The feeling is real. The trend behind it is not. There is a second, subtler driver of the illusion worth naming, because it shows up every single time a major quake hits. When a large earthquake makes headlines, people suddenly start paying attention to earthquakes, and they notice all the other ones happening around the world that they would normally have scrolled past. The Kamchatka Doublet draws your eye, and then you notice a quake in the Philippines, one in Japan, one in the middle of the Atlantic, and it feels like a coordinated surge. But those other earthquakes were always happening. You are just looking now. This attention effect manufactures the sensation of a cluster out of what is really just ordinary global activity finally being watched. It is a trick of the spotlight, not a change in the play. Why does this matter for Kamchatka? Because it keeps the focus where it belongs. The reason to pay attention to this doublet is not that the whole planet is somehow accelerating toward catastrophe. It is that one specific, well-understood, extraordinarily dangerous fault produced a specific, unusual sequence with a specific, frightening history behind it. The honest version of the story is more unsettling than the conspiracy version, not less, because it is real. You do not need the Earth to be waking up for Kamchatka to be worth watching. You only need to understand what this one fault has already done, and that clarity matters even more when we turn to the next claim, the one that drags the sun into it. Part 11. The Quiet Sun. There is a popular idea that solar storms reach across 93 million miles of space and shake the ground beneath our feet. Every time the sun throws off a flare or a cloud of charged particles near the same window as a big earthquake, the claim resurfaces. The sun set off the quake. And on the morning of the Kamchatka Doublet, that claim runs into an inconvenient fact, one that the data settles cleanly. The sun was quiet. Let me give you the actual conditions, because this is a case where the numbers do the arguing for us. On June 19th, the geomagnetic activity around Earth was low, the planetary index that tracks it sitting well below storm levels. The solar wind was modest. There was no Earth-directed eruption of solar material slamming into our magnetic field, no significant storm in progress at all. In other words, on the very day this violent earthquake sequence struck, space weather was about as calm as it gets. If you wanted to argue that a solar storm triggered these quakes, the sun itself refuses to cooperate, because there was no storm to point to. The timing simply does not work. Let me be fair to the instinct behind the claim, because it is not stupid, even though the conclusion is wrong. People sense, correctly, that the Earth and the Sun are connected. Space weather is real. A powerful solar storm genuinely can disrupt satellites, degrade radio communication, and induce currents that stress electrical grids. So it is not crazy to wonder whether the same sun that can knock out a power grid might also be able to shake the ground. The leap that fails is the assumption that because the sun affects some Earth systems, it must affect all of them, including the movement of tectonic plates kilometers below the surface. That is where the reasoning breaks, and the Kamchatka morning is a clean illustration of why, because the supposed cause was simply absent. The fault broke violently while the sun was calm. Walk through what the calm sun actually means for this specific event, because the timing leaves no room for the claim. If a solar storm had triggered these earthquakes, you would expect to see a solar storm. You would expect a flare, a cloud of charged particles hitting Earth, a spike in geomagnetic activity around the time of the rupture. None of that was present on June 19th. The geomagnetic conditions were quiet, the solar wind was unremarkable, and there was no significant eruption aimed at Earth. The cupboard, in other words, was bare. There was no trigger to point to, which means the entire claim collapses for this event, before you even get to the more fundamental problem that no reliable mechanism for solar triggering has ever been established. The earthquakes off Kamchatka were the work of the slow grinding of plates, full stop, and the quiet sun overhead is the proof that no cosmic culprit is needed or available. It is worth noticing the pattern these claims share, because recognizing it protects you against the next one too. Each of them takes a real connection and stretches it past the breaking point. The sun really does affect Earth, so people imagine it must cause earthquakes. Earthquakes really do cluster in time and space as aftershocks, so people imagine a hidden global surge. Technology really is powerful, so people imagine it can shatter tectonic plates. In every case, a genuine kernel of truth is inflated into a false conclusion that the evidence does not support. The antidote is not cynicism but proportion, asking not merely whether two things could be connected, but whether the evidence actually shows that they are, and at what scale. Applied to Kamchatka, that discipline gives a clear answer every time. The cause of the doublet was tectonic, the sun was quiet, the global rate is steady, and no machine was involved. The honest explanation was sitting in the rock the entire time, and this is on top of a more basic problem with the whole idea. There is no robust, repeatable scientific evidence that solar activity triggers earthquakes in the first place. People have looked carefully for decades, and the supposed connections tend to evaporate under scrutiny. The energy involved in space weather, while it can genuinely disrupt satellites and power grids and radio, does not translate into the kind of force that breaks locked tectonic plates kilometers below the seafloor. The earthquakes off Kamchatka were produced by the slow, colossal grinding of the Pacific plate diving beneath Asia, the same engine that has been running for millions of years. They did not need the sun, and on this particular morning the sun was not even awake enough to take the blame. The cause is in the rock, exactly where the central thread of this story has been pointing all along, and it is worth remembering that this restless fault is just one of many moving on any given day. Part 12. One node. On a restless planet. Kamchatka did not break in isolation. In the same span of days, the planet produced other strong earthquakes in other places, and noticing them helps put the doublet in its proper frame. There was a notable quake in the Izu Islands region of Japan. There was strong activity in the Philippines. There was even a pair of solid earthquakes far out on the mid-Atlantic ridge in the lonely middle of the Atlantic Ocean. To someone scrolling through alerts, all of this at once can feel like the world coming apart. But to a seismologist, it looks like a normal week on a planet that is always, everywhere in motion. This is the texture worth holding on to. On any given day, the Earth is producing dozens of earthquakes large enough to be felt somewhere, scattered along the boundaries where its plates meet. The ring of fire that loops around the Pacific, the long seams of the mid-ocean ridges, the crumple zones where continents collide, all of them are active essentially all the time. So the fact that Kamchatka, Japan, the Philippines, and the Atlantic all registered strong quakes in the same window is not evidence of some coordinated global event. It is evidence that the planet is exactly as restless as it always is, and that we are now watching all of it at once in real time. There is one more claim that surfaces after almost every major earthquake, and it deserves a quick, firm answer on the grounds of simple physics. Some people insist that earthquakes like the Kamchatka doublet are manufactured, triggered deliberately by some human technology aimed at the ground. The cleanest way to dismantle this is with an energy budget. The amount of energy released by a single magnitude 6.6 earthquake is staggering, equivalent to a very large nuclear detonation, and the energy of the great megathrust events dwarfs even that by factors of thousands. No human technology can deliver that kind of energy into a locked tectonic plate kilometers beneath the seafloor. The forces involved are planetary in scale, the product of continents in slow collision over millions of years. To imagine a machine that could trigger them is to misunderstand the sheer magnitude of what a subduction zone stores. The Kamchatka fault did not need any help. It has been loading itself at 80 millimeters a year since long before any modern technology existed. Keep that scale in mind as you picture the planet's daily seismic rhythm, because it puts the whole restless week in proportion. The Earth produces tens of thousands of small earthquakes every year, hundreds large enough to be widely felt, and a handful of true giants. The boundaries where the plates meet are essentially always active, somewhere, all the time. So a week with strong quakes in Kamchatka, Japan, the Philippines, and the Atlantic is not a planet in crisis. It is a planet behaving exactly as a living, tectonically active world behaves, observed by a species that has finally built the instruments to see all of it at once. The activity is not the anomaly. Our total awareness of it is the new thing. But here is the distinction that brings us right back to the center of the story. Out of all that worldwide activity, the Kamchatka doublet stands apart, and not because it was the biggest number on the list. It stands apart because of the specific combination we have spent this whole video unpacking. A doublet, on a megathrust, with a 1952 record, producing a tsunami warning on a fault that sits beneath a city of nearly 200,000 people. The other quakes are the normal background hum of a living planet. Kamchatka is the one with the history that demands a closer look, and that is exactly why the people whose job is to watch these things were not distracted by the noise. They were focused on the one signal that, on this fault, you can never afford to ignore. Part 13. What watching Kamchatka actually means. When scientists say they are watching a fault, it is easy to imagine it as helplessness dressed up in technical language. It is not. Watching, in the way the experts mean it, is an active, disciplined process, and understanding what it actually involves is the difference between feeling powerless and feeling informed. After the Kamchatka Doublet, watching meant something very specific, and it is the practical answer to the dread that the sequence stirred up. It meant tracking the aftershocks in real time against the patterns we discussed, checking hour by hour whether the sequence was decaying on schedule or running hot, whether the rate was dropping the way it should, whether any new large event broke the expected shape. It meant keeping the tsunami warning infrastructure primed, ready to fire again instantly if a new, shallower, more vertical rupture occurred on the locked part of the Megathrust. It meant the unglamorous, essential work of monitoring a fault that cannot be predicted, but can be observed with extraordinary care. None of that stops an earthquake, but it is what stands between a coastal population and a wave they never saw coming, and on a fault with the Kamchatka record, that readiness is not a luxury, it is the entire game. And this is where the story turns from fear towards something more useful, because the honest lesson of the Kamchatka Doublet is not that we should be afraid. It is that we should be prepared in the specific, unglamorous ways that actually save lives. Coastal communities near major subduction zones live with a simple, powerful rule that needs no scientist to interpret it. If the ground shakes hard enough that you struggle to stand, and you are near the coast, you do not wait for an official warning to move to high ground. The earthquake itself is the warning. The people of the Kuril Islands learned that lesson at a terrible cost in 1952, and it remains the single most important piece of knowledge anyone living in the shadow of a megathrust can carry. Preparedness is the rational response to a fault you cannot predict, and it is the opposite of panic. Let me describe the machinery that makes this watching possible, because it is one of the quiet triumphs of modern science and most people never think about it. Around the Pacific, a layered system stands guard. There are seismometers that detect an earthquake within minutes and immediately estimate its size and location. There are instruments on the open ocean floor paired with surface buoys, designed to sense the faint passage of a tsunami in the open ocean and confirm whether a wave has actually formed long before it reaches a coast. There are warning centres staffed around the clock, where analysts take all of that incoming data and make the call. This is the system that issued the Kamchatka warning within a minute of the main shock, and it is the same system that, after sensing no destructive wave, was able to stand the warning down. It is not perfect, and it cannot stop an earthquake, but it represents a genuine ability to see danger coming that simply did not exist a few generations ago. Understand the single most important link in that whole chain, because it is not a satellite or a buoy. It is a person knowing what to do. For communities close to a fault like Kamchatka's, the nearest coast can be struck by a tsunami in minutes, faster than any official warning can possibly reach everyone. This is why the most vital piece of preparedness is also the simplest, and it requires no technology at all. If you are near the coast and the ground shakes so hard that you cannot stand, or it shakes for a long, frightening stretch of time, that shaking is itself the warning. You do not wait for a siren or an alert on your phone. You move to high ground immediately on foot and you stay there. The earthquake is the alarm. The communities of the Kuril Islands learned this at a terrible cost in 1952, and that hard lesson has since saved lives in tsunami after tsunami around the world, wherever people remembered it in time. Think about what this means for a place like Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, because it transforms the story from one of helpless dread into one of agency. The people who live in the shadow of this megathrust cannot stop it from breaking, and they cannot know when it will. But they can build to better standards, they can run drills, they can map their evacuation routes to high ground, and they can carry that one essential rule in their bones, that hard or long shaking near the coast means move now. Notice that this same logic scales all the way up, from a single household to an entire civilization, which is what makes it more than local advice. Nations that live with great subduction zones have learned, often through tragedy, to invest in the unglamorous machinery of survival. Stricter building codes, regular drills, clearly marked evacuation routes, public education that turns a frightening rule into second nature. These investments do not prevent earthquakes any more than an individual can. What they do is change the outcome when the earthquake finally comes, converting what might have been mass casualties into something survivable. The countries that take this seriously are not the ones that have figured out how to predict the unpredictable. They are the ones that have accepted they cannot, and have chosen to be ready instead. That choice, made at the scale of a whole society, is the most powerful response we have to a fault like Kamchatka's, and it is available to anyone willing to take the threat seriously before it arrives. That is not paralysis in the face of an unpredictable fault. It is the opposite. It is the rational, empowering response to living somewhere dangerous, the same response that lets people live productively on floodplains and in hurricane zones, and along every other edge where nature is powerful. Preparedness converts terror into routine, and routine, practiced faithfully, is what saves lives when the fault finally moves. This is why the honest takeaway from the Kamchatka Doublet is not that you should be afraid, and this is the point I most want you to carry away from tonight. Fear is paralysis, and paralysis helps no one. The useful response, the one modelled by the scientists watching the aftershocks, and the warning centres standing ready, and the coastal residents who know to climb, is preparedness braided with attention. It is the willingness to look directly at a real danger, to understand it accurately, to respect what it could do, and then to take the concrete, unglamorous steps that tilt the odds towards survival. That posture is available to all of us, not just to the people who happen to live above this particular fault, because every one of us lives on the same restless planet, just with different hazards at our own doorsteps. Let me make the personal version of this concrete, because preparedness can sound like a slogan until you translate it into specific acts. For anyone who lives near a major fault or a tsunami-prone coast, it means knowing, before anything happens, where the high ground is and how to reach it on foot. It means securing the heavy objects in a home that become projectiles in violent shaking. It means having a plan that does not depend on a phone alert arriving in time, because near a fault the alert may not beat the wave. It means treating the ground itself as the primary warning system, and trusting that instinct enough to act on it without waiting for permission. None of these steps require predicting an earthquake, which is the thing we cannot do. They only require respecting that one is possible, which is the thing we know for certain. That shift, from waiting for a prediction that will never come to preparing for a possibility we can name, is the entire practical lesson of a morning like the one off Kamchatka. So the watchfulness around Kamchatka is not fear, and it is not fatalism. It is the mature middle ground between them, the recognition that we cannot know the future of this fault, but we can refuse to be caught unaware by it. The scientists watching the aftershocks, the warning centres standing ready, the coastal residents who know to move when the ground roars, all of them are practicing the same discipline. They are looking directly at a danger they cannot control, and choosing to be ready instead of either ignoring it or being paralysed by it. That, in the end, is what watching Kamchatka actually means, and it leads us to the final, larger truth that this whole strange morning has been circling. Part 14. The Weight of a Small Number. Everything about this story comes down to a single, uncomfortable piece of arithmetic. The chance that the Kamchatka Doublet was the beginning of something catastrophic is small. The consequences, if it were, would be enormous, and when you multiply a small probability by an enormous consequence, you get something that you cannot simply dismiss no matter how much you would like to. That is the entire reason scientists are nervous, and it is the reason this sequence is worth 2 hours of your attention rather than a passing headline. The number is small. The stakes are a magnitude 9 and a wave that crosses an ocean. We have walked through the whole anatomy of this event, and the pieces now fit together into one clear shape. 2 major earthquakes struck the same patch of Pacific seafloor 60 seconds apart, proving that the ruptures out there can trigger one another. They landed on the Kuril-Kamchatka Megathrust, one of the most violent boundaries on the planet, the same fault that produced a magnitude 9 and drowned coastlines across the Pacific in 1952. A tsunami warning fired, and the sea stayed flat, not because the fault is harmless, but because the hidden details of depth and motion happened to fall on the safe side this time, and the statistical tools that scientists used told them the sequence would most likely fade while quietly refusing to promise it. Every one of those facts points back to the same place, a small probability, sitting on top of a catastrophic history, on a fault that will not tell us its plans. I think the most profound thing this morning has to teach us is about the nature of living on a planet like this one. We build our cities on the thin, cooling skin of a world whose interior is still churning with the heat of its own creation, and most of the time we're allowed to forget that. We forget that the ground is a temporary truce, that the continents are riding on slabs of rock that are still in slow, relentless collision, that the same forces that raise the mountains and the volcanoes can, in a few seconds, take it all back. Kamchatka, on the morning of June 19th, 2026, was a reminder, written in 2 earthquakes 60 seconds apart, that the truce is exactly that, a truce and not a permanent peace. Let me put the arithmetic of small numbers in front of you one more time, because it is the single idea I most want to survive this video. We are wired to treat unlikely things as impossible things. If something has only a few % chance of happening, we round it down to 0 in our minds and stop worrying about it, and most of the time that instinct serves us fine. But the instinct fails badly when the rare outcome is catastrophic, because then the size of the disaster has to be weighed against the smallness of the odds, and a tiny probability multiplied by an enormous consequence is not a tiny thing. It is a serious thing. This is why we buy insurance against fires that will probably never happen, why we wear seatbelts for crashes we do not expect. And it is exactly why scientists treat a small chance of a great earthquake on the Kamchatka Megathrust as worthy of sleepless attention. The number is small. The thing the number is attached to is a magnitude 9 and a wave that crosses an ocean. We live, in a real sense, on borrowed stability. The calm we experience day to day is not the permanent state of the planet, but a pause between releases, a quiet stretch in a cycle that has been running since long before us and will continue long after. The mountains, the coastlines, the very shape of the land around a place like Kamchatka were all built by exactly the forces that produced this doublet, accumulated over spans of time the human mind can barely hold. We tend to mistake the pause for the rule, to assume that because the ground has been still in our experience it is still by nature. It is not. It is a balance held in tension, and tension, by definition, does not hold forever. Consider how poorly our sense of time is matched to a fault like this, because that mismatch is the quiet villain of the whole story. The Kamchatka Megathrust operates on a clock measured in decades and centuries. It loaded for decades before 1952, and it has been loading again in the decades since. But a human life is short, and human memory is shorter, and a city can fill with people who have never personally felt the worst the fault can do, who think of the ground as stable simply because it has been stable for as long as they happen to remember. The fault does not care what we remember. It keeps its own time, winding the spring at 80 millimeters a year, indifferent to the fact that the last great rupture has faded from living memory for most of the people now living above it. That gap between geological time and human memory is precisely where catastrophe likes to hide, and it is why a doublet that jolts us back into awareness is, in its way, a gift, however unwelcome. So think of what this doublet actually did for those of us willing to listen. It reached up from a fault on the far edge of the Pacific and for one morning forced the whole monitoring world to confront the question that the ground refuses to answer in advance. 2 earthquakes, 60 seconds apart, on the fault that drowned the Pacific in 1952, followed by a barrage that would not quickly fade, followed by a tsunami warning, followed by a merciful and uncertain silence. It did not bring the catastrophe. It almost certainly will not. But it pulled back the curtain for a moment on the machine beneath Kamchatka and reminded everyone watching that the machine is still there, still loaded, still capable of the unthinkable, and still entirely on its own schedule. That reminder is worth holding on to long after the headlines move on. Let me leave you with the image that has stayed with me through all of this, because it captures the strange honesty of where we actually stand. Somewhere off the coast of Kamchatka, on the floor of the North Pacific, 2 slabs of rock the size of continents are still pressed against each other, still locked, still being pushed past their limit at the speed your fingernails grow. We cannot see them, we cannot stop them, we cannot tell them when to move or persuade them to wait. All we can do is listen, with instruments scattered across the planet, to the faint signals that leak up through the rock, and try to read in them the difference between a fault settling down and a fault loading up. On the morning of June 19th, 2026, Those signals said, most likely, settling down, with a small and stubborn chance of something far worse. That is not a comfortable answer, but it is the true one, and the people who gave it did not flinch from either half of it. So when you hear that scientists are watching a fault on the far side of the world, I hope you now hear it differently. I hope you hear not a vague, distant worry, but the specific, honest weight of people standing at the edge of what is knowable, tracking the odds on a danger they cannot control, refusing both false calm and false panic. The wave did not come this time. The aftershocks will, in all likelihood, fade. The most probable ending to this particular story is a quiet one, but the fault is still there, still locked, still winding the spring at 80 millimeters a year, and the people who understand it best will not look away, because they know that on this boundary, the difference between an ordinary morning and an unthinkable one can come down to which way a single piece of seafloor decides to move in the dark. The only question left is whether the rest of us are paying as much attention as the fault deserves.